Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The week my parents flew to the beach without me, I was the one who paid for the seat upgrades. Though I did not know it until the sunburn-proof smiled at me from a photo where my mother held a drink with a bright umbrella and my father wore a new linen shirt that looked like a promise to forget every hard conversation we had ever had. And I remember thinking that the color of the ocean behind them matched the little confirmation banner I saw every Friday after work when the bank app congratulated me for another successful transfer of $600. I had built that routine the way nurses build muscle memory, with steady hands and a stubborn belief that showing up mattered more than being thanked. So every Friday, after a week of double shifts and the stale coffee that lives in overnight hallways, I sent money for their medications, for the electric bill that never seemed to get smaller, for the groceries my mother said cost more every month, and for the 100 little emergencies that hovered around my father's voice like gnats when he called to say he did not want to worry me, but just so I knew, the car sounded strange again. When you send money consistently, the people you love begin to speak in a certain grammar, where requests become weather and the word help turns into humidity, always their weather or not the forecast mentions it. And I accepted that climate because I told myself I was the daughter who could be counted on, the daughter who managed her life like a well-stocked cart, the daughter who did not need a thank you as long as the pharmacy rang up on time and the power stayed on through the winter storms. The photo that ruined that weather arrived with the lazy cruelty of a public post, my brother's doing of course, because Ethan believes the universe is most real when it is witnessed, so there he was on a deck with string lights, one arm around our mother, another around our father, his smile wide enough to pretend there were no empty chairs, and below the image, he had tagged the resort, the restaurant, and even the gelato stand as if mapping the trip that my $600 had quietly paved. I stared too long at those little tags, at the blue dots of confirmation, and then I saw a second album titled Family Week, which was either a joke or a confession. I called because I still believed in conversations, because I am a nurse and I know that sometimes the thing you need to say loses its fever if you say it out loud. And my father answered with a voice he reserves for salespeople and women on airplanes who ask him to switch seats, and when I said, lightly as I could manage, that the photos looked beautiful and I hoped they were having a good time, he sighed the way men sigh when they are tired of the truth, then said they were and that they did not invite me because they wanted to relax, and because I tend to worry, and because, and here he cleared his throat as if making space for honesty, they did not want me there. It is a funny thing about hurt, how it rearranges the furniture without asking, how the room looks the same, but you keep bumping your hip on a table that has shifted by the width of a secret. So I stood in my kitchen with my hand still on the counter and listened to my father explain that it was nothing personal, that Ethan had been through a lot with his business, that Mom needed a break from stress, and that I would not have enjoyed it anyway, since everyone wanted to forget real life for a week. And while he said this, I thought about the list of charges from the past month, the new sunglasses, the massage gift card, the travel insurance, and how every one of those had been concealed under the soft blanket of words like medication and emergency. I did not cry, because the tears had better things to do, like irrigate the dry patch in me where respect used to live, so I thanked him for the honesty he prized and told him to have a wonderful time. And when the call ended, I stood for a moment longer and felt something in me click into place the way a seatbelt locks when the car decelerates, that small mechanical promise that says forward motion will not throw you through the glass today. Revenge, when you have a conscience and a mortgage, does not look like fireworks. It looks like spreadsheets and a calm tone and the decision to stop feeding a machine that does not even acknowledge you are the one shoveling coal. So I opened my bank app and renamed the standing transfer from parent support to not wanted fund, a tiny joke that made my chest loosen, and I canceled the rule that sent $600 every Friday. Then I set a new automated transfer for $1 with a memo line that read, just checking if the system still works, and I forwarded the travel insurance policy to my own email, because the subscriber name was mine. And I paused the secondary card on their warehouse membership because I was the primary and because my mother once told me I worried too much about details, which sounded like an invitation to worry more precisely. By the time I finished and closed my laptop, the sun had slipped into that thin hour where the day pretends it might reconsider, and my phone buzzed with a picture from the beach. My mother in a wide hat waving at a horizon she believed was harmless. And I allowed myself one small, mean thought that tasted like medicine. Then I put the phone face down and went to bed early, feeling the strange, clean silence that comes when you stop underwriting someone else's happy hour and begin, quietly, to finance your own. When the plain photos gave way to videos of beach laughter and sunset toasts, I learned that ignoring hurt feels a lot like physical therapy, repetitive and clumsy at first. Then suddenly you notice that the motion you could not bear yesterday has become a stretch you can hold. So I went to work, charted vitals, reset IVs, and let other people's pain be the anchor that kept mine from drifting into the kind of melodrama I judge in strangers. Yet every time my phone buzzed, I could feel that sentence, "We did not want you there," walk across my chest in heavy boots. And I would remind myself that the woman who can keep a panicking patient breathing through a clogged nebulizer can also keep her own lungs steady while her parents perform joy in matching resort bracelets. The first call after the trip came with the brittle cheer my mother saves for people she is about to manipulate, a sugar glaze too shiny to be trusted, and she told me the ocean was beautiful, the light healing, the family time restorative. Then asked in the same breath if I had seen an odd charge from the pharmacy because her blood pressure pills were suddenly expensive and the tech had mumbled something about the discount plan being paused, and I said I had seen it and that it was not odd at all because the discount plan was under my account and my account had decided to take a vacation of its own, one with no photos and no bracelets. And before she could spool up into guilt, I softened my voice and explained that I was reorganizing my finances like any responsible adult might after an eye-opening month, which sounded so reasonable that for a second I watched her search for a foothold and come up empty. My father tried a different tactic, a speech about energy and tone, how I tended to bring a cloud to sunny days, how the family needed lightness, how Ethan had been under tremendous stress with his business and deserved an uncomplicated week. And I listened with the patience that has gotten me through 100 waiting rooms where some relative needs to blame someone for a disease nobody ordered. Then I thanked him for his feedback like he was a Yelp reviewer and told him that in the spirit of his new commitment to lightness, I was delighted to make their financial weather match their emotional forecast, bright and independent with no chance of Julia's credit card, and I hung up before he could elevate the conversation to a sermon. There is a particular pleasure in tidy revenge that does not scorch the earth, a housekeeping for the soul. So I pulled every forgotten thread I had used to tie our lives together and began to unknot them with care. I removed my name from the auto refill at the pharmacy and transferred the loyalty points into my own balance, which felt petty until I remembered how many times I had been told I was overthinking. And I called the utilities to confirm that the internet bundle, which I had upgraded when my father discovered streaming sports, would bill to their address exclusively by the end of the month. And I canceled the secondary card on the grocery membership after redeeming a small mountain of accrued rewards for a pantry delivery to my apartment because sometimes symbolism needs snacks. I also made a polite call to the cell carrier because I was the account holder and generosity had gradually expanded into a family plan that functioned like a group project, all the cost on me and all the fun on them. And I arranged for a clean separation with a grace period that would keep their phones alive until the following Friday, a curiously familiar day, after which they could pick a plan that matched their appetite for independence. And I will confess that when the representative thanked me for being a long-term customer and asked if there was anything else she could do, I asked her to note on the account that I had declined a loyalty vacation upgrade because it did not include me, which was not a real product and not a real note, but made us both laugh in the dull fluorescent light of an American errand. For 2 quiet weeks, I heard little beyond the occasional social media echo, Ethan tagging another restaurant as if a breadcrumb trail could justify the feast, and in that silence I discovered that my apartment had a new sound. The low hum of a space that did not have to apologize for anyone's choices, and I cooked a late dinner without texting photos to prove I was alive. I slept a full night without the automatic transfer nagging like a smoke alarm in another room. And I woke to a morning that smelled like coffee and not like obligation, and although I know that sounds dramatic, I will say that anyone who has stepped out of a room where they were tolerated rather than welcomed will understand how a countertop can look like a horizon. On the third Friday without my money, the messages arrived in a flurry that pretended to be casual and then shed the costume almost immediately. My mother starting with a soft "good morning, sweetheart" and a question about my weekend plans before pivoting into a note that the rent payment had bounced and the landlord was being unreasonable. My father adding that banking errors happen to everyone and could I kindly call the branch manager like I did last year when the system double-billed them. And when I did not answer within an hour, the tone sharpened into a collective declaration that they felt abandoned, that family should be above dollars, that I had always been fragile about vacations and needed to get over it, which might have stung more if they had not accidentally sent a screenshot of the landlord's late fee notice that included the line item for a luxury cable package, a detail that glowed like a neon sign over a dim bar. I chose not to argue, because disputes about values are marathons with no finish line, so I replied with a practical note that explained how to set up autopay from their own account, a link to a budgeting template, and a suggestion to call the landlord to negotiate a payment plan, then, because I do believe in learning moments and cannot resist a clean gesture. I attached a photo of the pantry delivery stacked neatly in my kitchen and wrote that I was switching to a cash envelope system for a while and could recommend it for anyone who wished to align their spending with their priorities, which is the kind of Midwestern revenge that wears a cardigan and still gets the point across. An hour later, after my message was met with a silence so loud I could hear it over the kettle, a new bubble appeared from Ethan with the performative calm of someone pretending to mediate while lighting a match, and he wrote that there was an urgent opportunity. A temporary fix that would solve everything, a simple formality requiring my signature and my excellent credit for just a little while, and while he was still typing the ellipses of his next justification, the group text chimed in unison with the words that told me the trip had not been a one-time indulgence, but the crest of a wave they expected me to surf forever. We need you to co-sign. The moment the request for co-signing arrived in the group text, my entire week shifted, not because of fear or obligation, but because of the clarity that comes when a person finally recognizes the full scope of someone else's entitlement. And I realized that for 12 months, I had been underwriting a version of my family that existed only in receipts, glowing screens, and carefully staged photos designed to hide the truth of where their money actually went and whose convenience it truly served. And the irony that my careful planning, my sacrifices, and my consistent loyalty had become the foundation for their enjoyment cut sharper than any argument I could muster in person. I did not respond immediately, because silence has a language all its own, and while my parents thrived on the noise of expectation, of constant approval and reinforcement, I allowed my absence to speak. To let the weight of unacknowledged generosity hover in the digital ether until they could almost feel it pressing against their chests like an invisible hand, and in that space, I began to notice patterns I had ignored for years. The sudden upgrades to Ethan's apartment, the extravagant dinners that appeared in credit card statements without explanation, the unnecessary subscriptions to clubs and memberships, and the way my parents spoke about him in tones that were somehow lighter, warmer, and infinitely more forgiving than anything ever reserved for me. It was a quiet awakening, one that unfolded not in anger, but in calculation, and as the days passed without my intervention, the first ripple appeared, subtle but unmistakable, an automated alert from the bank that a scheduled transfer had failed. And within 24 hours, a flurry of messages arrived from my mother, her voice digital but frantic, pressing with the familiar cadence of a woman trying to translate panic into blame, insisting that the landlord was unreasonable, that the pharmacy had mischarged them, that bills were stacking in a way that threatened to undo the delicate equilibrium they always claimed to maintain without ever acknowledging that their safety net had been entirely supplied by me. I listened to every word, cataloged every complaint, every accusation, every plea cloaked in the language of necessity, and I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of noticing how dependent their panic had become on my compliance. How predictable their desperation had grown in the absence of automatic payment, and yet I did not act impulsively, because revenge measured and deliberate holds a resonance that instantaneous rage cannot match, and I spent the night organizing accounts, rerouting payments to a separate fund I named Freedom, a subtle rebuke that existed in plain sight, invisible except to me, ensuring that the same $600 that had once disappeared from my account into theirs would now accumulate quietly, insistently, entirely beyond their reach or knowledge. The following day, Ethan attempted contact, his tone casual, but his words heavy with expectation, presenting the loan documents under the guise of urgency, claiming that a minor signature from me would prevent catastrophic consequences for a business that had never been stable and had never been transparent, and as he typed, he revealed more than he intended: receipts, invoices, credit statements, all tracing a path that my contributions had built, the invisible scaffolding that had allowed their carefree indulgences to flourish while leaving me ostensibly in control, but functionally ignored, and I realized that they had been counting on my silence not as generosity, but as a guarantee, a renewable resource they could exploit indefinitely. I took my time reading every line, every detail, every nuance of the documents, noticing where the business had spent tens of thousands of dollars on items that contributed nothing to its operations, but inflated its appearance of success for the benefit of my brother, and I allowed the full weight of comprehension to settle over me. The realization that my loyalty had funded their duplicity, that my patience had enabled their selective neglect, and that my absence from their vacation was not oversight but strategy, a test they had passed by proving precisely how much I could bear without complaint. Then, carefully, deliberately, I initiated steps to extricate myself from their financial ecosystem, contacting the bank, confirming that no new obligations could be assigned to me, redirecting all future payments to my personal account, and subtly notifying the financial institutions involved that any attempt to leverage my name without explicit consent would be met with immediate formal action, all the while maintaining the outward appearance of consideration and cooperation, because in matters of family and finance, overt hostility often collapses under its own weight, whereas quiet, meticulous control leaves consequences in its wake that are unavoidable and absolute. By the time evening fell, the messages had intensified, more frequent, more desperate, as if the mere absence of my compliance could be felt through the phone, and I read each one, catalogued each appeal, and allowed myself to enjoy the restrained satisfaction of their frustration, the recognition that the dependence they had cultivated for years was now turning against them, and, in the quiet of my apartment, I realized that the silence I had maintained was a weapon far more effective than confrontation, and that their realization of what they had lost, of what they had relied upon without acknowledgement, would resonate more profoundly than any argument I could have made in anger. And so, as the night deepened, I set aside my phone, allowed the quiet to settle in the corners of the room, and understood for the first time that the cost of silence is not in restraint but in strategy, and that in this game, patience, observation, and meticulous planning yield outcomes far beyond the reach of immediate satisfaction, leaving those who underestimate it to stumble in the wake of consequences they cannot foresee but will certainly endure. When the request for me to co-sign arrived, it carried with it an air of urgency that was manufactured as carefully as a sales pitch, and while the words were polite on the surface, I recognized immediately the undercurrent of expectation, the assumption that my compliance was as inevitable as the sunrise, and as I examined the attached documents, I began to see the full architecture of their manipulation, the careful way in which my name, my credit, and my sense of familial obligation had been entwined into a system designed to ensure that their comfort, their indulgences, and their favoritism toward Ethan would never falter, and the realization of how much I had enabled struck me with the weight of years of unacknowledged labor and silent endurance, a ledger of loyalty that had been spent without a single acknowledgement of my presence beyond the mechanical act of transferring funds. I studied every page, every clause, every line item with a precision born of necessity, noting the invisible trails of expense that traced from my accounts to new furniture, luxury experiences, and business investments that were never viable and never intended to be sustainable. And in those lines, I could see the pattern that had emerged over the past year, a pattern of quiet exploitation that had been masked with gratitude and affectionate language. The words "thank you" floating above the reality that the transfers I had made were no longer about survival, about rent, utilities, or groceries, but about a lifestyle curated exclusively for them and my brother, a lifestyle that my labor had financed entirely. While my emotional and physical presence was deemed unnecessary, inconvenient, or even undesirable, I realized that any immediate reaction, any overt confrontation, would only give them the opportunity to manipulate further, to frame their own recklessness as crisis and my resistance as cruelty. So I approached the situation with the methodical patience of someone who has been underestimated for too long and understands that quiet control carries consequences far heavier than verbal sparring, and I began to plan, step by step, how to sever the financial tether that had tied my freedom to their indulgence while preserving the appearance of cooperation and goodwill, a delicate balancing act that required foresight, timing, and a degree of restraint I had cultivated over years of both professional and personal necessity. First, I contacted the bank to clarify that no loan could be authorized in my name without explicit consent, explaining that I had been alerted to an irregular request and requesting confirmation that all accounts tied to me would require direct verification before approval, and as I spoke to the representative, I carefully allowed hints of context to seep through, suggesting that any attempt to leverage my personal credit for external purposes would be considered a potential fraud, leaving them unspoken but understood, a subtle shield against the assumptions of entitlement that had characterized my parents' and brother's behavior for far too long. Then I initiated the meticulous process of extracting myself from any existing obligations, reviewing shared accounts, memberships, and automatic billing, transferring balances to my private fund, and quietly rerouting payments to ensure that no future actions could implicate me financially without my explicit participation, a process that required patience, verification, and an attention to detail that mirrored the care I had once lavished on their well-being, and in each step, I felt the satisfaction that comes from reclaiming authority over what had been taken for granted, understanding that the most effective revenge is rarely loud or public, but precise, deliberate, and irreversible. Throughout the day, I maintained the outward appearance of cooperation, responding to inquiries with measured politeness, asking questions about dates, procedures, and verification requirements, all while quietly undermining the framework that had depended entirely on my compliance. And as the hours passed, I noticed the first signs of panic emerging in their messages, a trembling urgency that betrayed how much they relied on my predictable generosity, how unprepared they were to navigate the consequences of their own decisions without the scaffolding I had provided, and I allowed the tension to settle around them as silently as a fog creeping over a valley, enveloping them without warning or escape. By evening, the consequences had begun to crystallize, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Calls from financial institutions, notifications of frozen accounts pending review, and urgent texts from Ethan that revealed both frustration and incredulity, a desperate attempt to regain control. And I observed these developments without haste, noting how the structures they had built on borrowed trust and unquestioned loyalty were collapsing in real time, and how their panic, their frantic requests, and their pleading for intervention revealed the very fragility of the system they had believed to be invincible, a system that had depended entirely on my presence, my silence, and my compliance, and now, for the first time, faced the consequences of their own choices without my mediation or support. In the quiet of my apartment, I reviewed each step I had taken and allowed myself a deep sense of satisfaction, not the shallow gloating of revenge and anger, but the profound recognition that a year of exploitation had been neutralized through careful, deliberate action, and that the leverage they had assumed over me, the unquestioned assumption that my loyalty was infinite, had been dismantled entirely, leaving them to confront the consequences of their own decisions, and in that stillness, I understood that power in a family is not always the loudest voice or the fastest response, but often the one who observes, waits, and acts with precision when the moment arrives. The morning after the bank called to confirm that the loan had been blocked and all accounts connected to my name were now protected, my phone became a relentless instrument of chaos, buzzing and chiming with a mixture of frantic messages, pleading emails, and phone calls that seemed to multiply with every glance at the screen. And as I scrolled through the notifications, I could feel the years of unacknowledged loyalty and quiet generosity coalescing into a tangible force that was now pressing back against the family who had long taken it for granted, revealing not only their dependence on me, but also the profound fragility of a comfort built entirely on borrowed resources and unquestioned obedience. My mother was first, her words rapidly shifting from concern to desperation as she detailed the cascading consequences of missed payments, unexpected fees, and the realization that every convenience she had enjoyed over the past 12 months had been sustained entirely by my accounts, and the text messages, though framed in soft tones and sprinkled with affection, carried the weight of someone who had finally understood the depth of her own reliance, a realization that had been postponed for too long by carefully cultivated assumptions and the habitual presence of a daughter who never said no. And as I read each carefully punctuated sentence, I felt an unexpected mixture of vindication and sorrow, because their distress was undeniable, yet entirely self-inflicted. Next came my father, whose voice on the phone oscillated between control and panic, attempting to negotiate, explain, and manipulate with the same persuasive cadence that had been so effective in the past, but now faltering in the face of systems and decisions that no longer responded to his commands or his expectations. And I realized that the pattern I had observed for months, the subtle favoritism, the covert indulgence of my brother, the constant management of their own lives through my labor and patience, had created a situation where their need for me had become visible, undeniable, and utterly uncontrollable. A stark contrast to the casual disregard and exclusion I had endured when they went on vacation without even a hint of consideration. Ethan's messages arrived in waves, a mixture of threats disguised as persuasion, appeals for reason, and the subtle arrogance of someone who had never truly measured the consequences of his actions. And in those lines I recognized the same entitlement and expectation that had defined the family dynamic for years, yet now strained against the firm boundaries I had established. Boundaries that were reinforced by the meticulous actions I had taken to protect my finances, redirect payments, and remove my co-signature from every possible instrument of their manipulation, a strategic isolation that allowed me to observe their desperation without being drawn into the chaos, maintaining a calculated distance that emphasized the consequences of their choices. As the hours passed, the pattern became unmistakable. Frantic coordination between my parents and brother, a flurry of calls and messages attempting to negotiate, plead, and in some moments, to accuse, all under the guise of familial concern. Yet transparently driven by the sudden loss of resources they had assumed to be inexhaustible, and I read each communication with the quiet precision of someone who had studied human behavior long enough to anticipate each escalation, each attempt at guilt, each implicit threat, and I allowed them to exhaust themselves against a boundary that was firm, invisible, and entirely justified, knowing that this was a form of revenge more effective than confrontation because it allowed them to fully experience the consequences of their manipulation without my active interference. By evening, the flood of messages had slowed, replaced by a steady trickle of resigned panic, and I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the years of support, the sacrifices made without acknowledgement, and the painstaking care I had taken to manage not only my parents' comfort, but the appearances they sought to maintain for themselves and my brother. And in that reflection, I understood that revenge does not always need to be dramatic or visible to the outside world. Sometimes it is simply a matter of reclaiming agency, of allowing those who have depended on you to navigate the absence of what they assumed would always be present. And in that reclamation, there is a satisfaction that is profound precisely because it is quiet, deliberate, and inevitable. Weeks later, After the initial panic subsided and the consequences of their financial recklessness became fully apparent, I received a letter from a law firm. The official notification that my parents had listed me as an emergency contact and were seeking assistance in matters that now carried legal and financial weight, and I read the letter without emotion, noting the irony that the very person they had excluded from vacations, celebrations, and decisions was now the one they considered indispensable in moments of true need, and I allowed the ambiguity of the situation to settle, choosing not to respond immediately, preserving the quiet power that had grown from my patience, observation, and deliberate action. In the solitude of my apartment, with the sun dipping below the horizon and the phone silent at last, I reflected on the lessons learned, the boundaries established, and the satisfaction derived from watching a system of exploitation correct itself without force, and I understood that some forms of revenge are not flashy or public, but exist in the reclamation of control, the quiet redirection of resources, and the conscious decision to allow those who have relied on you to confront the consequences of their own choices, leaving them to grapple with the fallout while you maintain your own peace, your own integrity, and the subtle knowledge that loyalty and generosity, when taken for granted, carry consequences that are both inevitable and instructive.